Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Recovery Machine. My name's Nathan. We're joined today by, as always, by my co-host, Corey. Hello, Corey. How are you doing?
Hey, Nathan. I'm good, thanks. Good to see you again.
You as well. And we've got a special guest here today who happens to also be my dad. His name is Burton, and we're bringing him in as somebody who's got a very wide, a very experienced background in the recovery world. And so we're going to get kind of a different perspective and see if he can help us out with today's topic. Hello, Burton.
Hello, Nathan. Hello, Corey. Thank you for inviting me to episode 8 of Recovery Machine. Glad to be here.
And we are glad to have you.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
My dad helps often with my Obsidian support services groups that I hold for healthcare professionals. We do that a couple times a week, and he's usually there at least once, sometimes twice. And I find that very helpful, not just to have kind of a backup in case for the rare occasion that I can't make it, but just to have somebody who's been around this kind of I guess material, you could say, for a long time, a lot longer than me. And often his insight is very valuable to the other members in the group. So I thank you for that, sir.
You're welcome. And it's part of recovery for me as well. My continued recovery is to be involved, to be connected. And if I contribute and help others, that's all the better for me as well.
Indeed. So today, what we're going to do, just to give you kind of an overview here, is our last topic was, the focus was rather narrow. It was a niche topic, and our aim was to help people who were specifically in those circumstances at that time. And I believe we did a decent job of providing information for somebody who was facing an IME. So that's all well and good. It might have been a little bit of a dry topic as far as for people who are just listening as from an outsider's perspective. But for this one, we're kind of going to look inwards and take more of an approach where we take a look at how an individual would feel at this point in their recovery journey. So they've been kind of examined. They've been put through this big process. They've learned that they're probably going to a treatment center. Their life has kind of been put on pause. So you're sitting in the void, and what emotion do you recall feeling most prominently during that period, Corey?
I think that shame was a really big one for me, among other emotions and other feelings. Shame was a factor in what led me into addiction, and that I was experiencing during addiction, and kind of was a fuel that kept me going. But it was also just very present when the fog of addiction was clearing, and I was sitting at home with, off work and nothing that I had to do. That was a feeling that was very, very present at the front of my mind. And I think I've learned, and you guys might agree, that it's a pretty common experience for people in our position.
Absolutely. Especially, I think it's a big shift if you're going from somebody who's respected for a profession that's main goal is to help people. Usually as a healthcare professional, you have a certain amount of status attached to your job title. So to kind of move that position down and view yourself differently, it's definitely something that I experienced, and it was hard. It was a big part of a big part of my recovery was trying to get back on my own team, even though I was feeling bad about myself and questioning what kind of a person I was, that kind of thing. So it's an important topic, and one that's important enough that I feel we do discuss it today. So to help us with that, we do have a Burton, and maybe you could tell us just a little bit about the kind of stuff that you've done in the recovery world back in I guess it was was it the 80s and the 90s you started doing that type of stuff? Or
Yeah, that's right. Late 80s, 90s was big for the recovery time. A lot of innovation and a lot of different things going on there. And I was lucky enough to be introduced to it early enough in my life that that I could get involved, and it's helped me a lot. My background is I came from a family that was had a history of alcoholism and different kinds of addictions and abuse and different things that were there to varying degrees. I come from a big family. I've got lots of siblings, and they, speaking with them, their experience was slightly different. So I'm speaking from my own experience of my family. I'm not laying blame or shame or anything on my family either. And it's just was my perspective that I saw things in my family and in my own personal development. I started to notice that things that I was not happy about that I learned as a child in my family were starting to come out in my personality. And I decided to address that and deal with it and get some counseling. And one of the first groups I went to was adult children of alcoholics. And it was an amazing experience to walk in there. It was very difficult to walk in there. And what was keeping me from walking in that door was that it was a big secret, in our family, that alcoholism and the problems that it was causing was a secret. It wasn't something that we spoke of outside the family. And that wasn't just implied. There was specific instructions not to talk about that. And so that was a source of shame right there. And part of what shame does is it wants to hide. So that was built right into my family dynamic. So to step into that room with strangers and, hi, my name is Burton. I'm an adult child. I'm an alcoholic. Even with that distance from, that one generation kind of distance, I wasn't saying I was an alcoholic, which would be even more difficult. But to say I'm part of a family that is experiencing these problems carried a lot of shame. And to do that, is half the battle. If you can step into a group, step out into the light a little bit, and especially I found it very helpful that what was in that room was not some organization, not some authority, some authority on the subject, but my peers. And as I heard those people speak that their own personal experience around that room, I realized I'm not alone. I'm not alone in this. This is happening in other homes. This is happening in other people's lives. And I found a new family there within the recovery world, and I've never looked back. I've since then, my goal was to work on any particular issue that came up in my life and find a group that dealt with that particular issue. And if I couldn't find a group, I started one. And I did the research and I invited others. And we worked on whatever it was we were working on. And I've continued that. I find that my facilitation in group forces me to be sharp and ahead and learn the latest and greatest and present that to the group. And it really helped me integrate that, not only to be a participant, but to step out even farther into the recovery world and start to facilitate those groups. And I think I'm really appreciative of being able to be connected with the Obsidian and recovery machine here to continue that work, because it's been very beneficial to me. So I guess that's kind of a overview there.
yeah, thanks. That's a great overview. I can remember being a teenager and not really understanding what you were doing, spending all this time, going to groups and talking to different strange people. And I can remember people would call late at night and you would be, trying to talk them through some sort of a crisis. and I didn't really understand what was going on there. But I think from what you've said before, you reached a point in your life where it was a sort of a crossroads, and you had to decide whether to take the time to work on yourself to try and deal with your past, or don't take the time and just kind of push it down and move forward with the risk of kind of passing those demons along. And at the time, I can remember being resentful because you weren't around as much as I would have liked. And it took me a few years to understand that the sacrifice you made was an important one. Can you remember, was there a time where you had to kind of debate that in your mind and make that call?
Yes, I specifically know I went to a group for survivors of sexual abuse for men, which was very rare in BC at that time. As far as I know, there was only one group in Prince George, which is 75 miles north of me, and the other one was in Vancouver. So another friend of mine that wanted to work on the same subject, we drove up to Prince George once a week for a whole winter, and there was some bad weather and stuff like that. And I was able to get into a group of men that had experienced the same thing. And we had a very good counselor running it. And one of the things that we did in that group was do a family history. So we had like a family tree going back as far as we could remember. Then we had, she would say, tick but beside the names, anybody that you knew or suspected had a problem with alcohol, tick, 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 all the way. Anybody that you knew had problems with sexual abuse in some way, tick, 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 unplanned pregnancies, tick, divorces, tick, all sorts of family dynamic and problem things like that. So you'd have this. I had this big map, and I come from a fairly big family, so it was quite huge. And then when it was all done, she said, "See where you are on that map." And I could see, sexual abuse running down this side of the family, and alcoholism and different things running down this side of the family. And there I am. She says, is it any wonder you're having problems? And this was just sweeping down. And the idea was, for me, I have to stop this in this generation. I cannot pass this stuff on to my kids, because it does seem to be multi-generational. We learn, we're going to talk a little bit about shame today. And shame is one of the drivers of addiction and these behaviors in families. It's really what drives it, as far as I understand. So if I was going to stop this in its tracks and not pass all this family history on to my kids, I had to do the work. And that was a sacrifice. I knew it was a sacrifice because I was taking time away from my kids that were growing up at the time. And it was a hard decision, but I had to do it. And like you said, you may not have understood it at the time, but that's what I was doing. It was a very conscious effort. The kind of idea at the time was, you can either pass this stuff on generationally, or you can pass it back. And I chose to pass it back. I saw it for what it was in my history and my family tree, and I was not going to pass that on to my kids. And that was my goal. So to whatever degree that I was successful, I think, when my kids got into trouble with different things in their life, I said, there's self-help, there's you can work on this stuff. You'll have to pick up the thread and maybe sort some things out for yourself. But I didn't want to pour all that family history on top of you. So if I could create some sort of a fence or barrier between myself and those generational learnings, then I would hope that it would benefit my children, and I believe it has. So
yeah, and that's those efforts are much appreciated for sure. I guess one of the things we should kind of get out of the way right away is there's often confusion between the terms guilt and shame. And maybe Corey, could you, in your opinion, what is the difference in those two terms to you?
Well, first of all, yeah, I think there is lots of confusion. I hear it misexplained, or I think I won't say misexplained. I'll say I hear people use the term or use the expression of guilt a lot, and guilt being that I did something wrong, versus shame being I am wrong, I am bad, I am lesser than. And I think they can exist simultaneously and side by side, and very often they do. And in my case, I think they certainly did. But if you break down the two, there are many explanations for why we did something bad. But to say I am bad, it has tremendous consequence. And so that's what I think. I think of the consequences of that and the feelings that it generates, and we're going to get into all of that. But what do you think about that, Burton?
Well, I would agree with that. Guilt to me is I did something wrong. Shame is I am bad. And the difference between those two for me is I did something wrong. That's something that I can rectify and change, and make restitution, recognize and repair. But when it's internal like that, it's something to do with my very being. It can really crush a person, and shame is, it's very difficult. It's, it's more about who I am as a person rather than what my behavior was. And it can be really, really devastating.
Yeah, it sure can. I think was the most dangerous part of my trying to get better. When I had my lowest lows, it was because of the negative rhetoric about what I am, not what I did. And trying to convince yourself otherwise when you've got this, you're already in a negative headspace. And then I had this evidence in front of me of these things that I had done, this path that I had chose. And I had to look at myself and ask, what kind of a person am I? How did I go from this point to this point? And if I was able to do that, then what does that say about my character? And you begin to take yourself apart from the interior. And that's a dangerous state of mind, because it's really hard to be on your own team when you're your number one critic.
Yeah, the other thing that came to mind for me is that as we were talking, the shame comes with a story. That guilt, the behaviors that are attached to the two, and the sort of the opinion that we have of ourselves as they relate to the two are quite different. And if you think about when you feel guilty, you might do something that you don't want to do, or it might drive you to do something extra for someone. But when you're ashamed, it brings you inward, you retreat, you isolate, or you try to mask it and bury it and do all these behaviors to cover it up. Whereas guilt, I don't think does the same thing. Would you agree?
I certainly would. What do you think, Dad?
Yes, I definitely agree. If we are feeling shame, we tend to withdraw. That's the immediate reaction. It's almost like a bright light is shining upon us on a stage, and we want to get out of that spotlight. The first thing is the aversion of the eyes. I can't look you in the eye. I can remember feeling that as a child a lot, not being able to look people in the eye. And that was the shame that I was feeling from my family situation or whatever. And, physically running away, just not being there. And what that does is it isolates us when we could really use some support and help. And it's a very difficult one. Whereas guilt, it's actually more socially accepted to be guilty of something, because you're expected to make restitution and change your behavior, but it's more external. It's more about what you did rather than who you are as a person, which is what shame really is.
Yeah, exactly. And we know the importance of avoiding the intuitive kind of motivation to self-isolate for many people who are especially early in recovery. I mean, that's one of the default positions. For me, I could easily self-isolate both in active addiction and early recovery. And shame just gives you a fantastic excuse to accelerate that process, which makes it, that's another part of why it's dangerous, I think.
Well, I think that's why a lot of overdoses that we're experiencing in British Columbia right now are done in private. It's not in a public setting. It's not with a friend. People are overdosing alone. And I think that the reason they're alone is because of the shame that's attached to that uncontrolled behavior there.
Exactly. Yeah. So you look at that emotion and you look at the impact it has, and you can consider it indirectly deadly in that way,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
The same way they're starting to talk about, I've seen discussions or heard discussions online about how the loneliness has become a topic of our current mental health crisis, as well as the opiate crisis. But understanding that loneliness and being by yourself can actually take years off your life, or put you in these situations where you're actually more likely to overdose. And it's pretty crazy to think that our species is so socially reliant on each other that when you separate us or cast us out of our tribe or our community, it actually can kill us.
Yeah.
Well, if you look at historically, banishment from the tribe was deadly. We are social creatures and we rely on each other, and we cannot, in the wilds, we can't survive on our own. A couple other examples of that I can think of, if people aren't familiar with addiction in particular, is how often people, when they're choking in public at a public restaurant, their immediate response is not to wave their arms and ask for help. It's to run to the bathroom to be private and deal with it privately, even though that's, if they don't get help, they may die. It's a very deadly reaction. So they would rather die than face the shame of the fact that they're choking in public.
Yeah.
And it also happens when people get lost in the bush. They will come out to a road, and then when somebody comes along, they will immediately go back into the bush because they don't want to be caught in that situation that they're ashamed about, is how stupid can I be that I got lost? And they will actually risk their life by evading, help, which is, maybe a couple of examples that people aren't struggling with addiction or don't recognize that, maybe they could identify with that a little bit better, that shame can be deadly in that way.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is why men don't get prostate exams. This is why prostate cancer and colorectal cancer are such killers in our society, and particularly of men, I think, is there are roots of that in shame.
Right. So that's what we're talking about. And, I think most people can identify with that, or, have had that experience where they would rather die than face the pain of shame. That's how emotionally painful it can be.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Corey.
Oh no, I was going to lead us into the next question there for Burton, and it kind of fits. So, and I've had this discussion in one of the recovery groups I'm in, asking folks to identify what the feeling of shame is, what the physiological response that our body has when we feel ashamed is, and I've noticed that a lot of people struggle with answering that question, or struggle with what that feeling is. And for me, being able to identify that feeling has been really, really helpful. And So I wondered if you'd given any thought to that, and if you can sort of walk us through that.
Okay, so the best way I could describe shame as social pain. It's a pain that we feel in the social context. And it might be you might recognize it in yourself and others with the difficulty with eye contact. So the lowering of the eyes, the lowering of the head, maybe even the palms and the coming up and covering the face. That's a common shame response. It's not like fear where your hands or palms might be out to ward off some attack. It's the pain is coming from being exposed, and it's commonly felt in the face as heat. There's often a blush response that other people can see, so it's not just heat coming up, but you can actually see that in someone's face. And the fact that we see it or we experience shame in our face is, I think, really interesting, because it shows that it is a social response. It's how we meet each other face to face, right? And we're exposed face to face. It can wash over the entire body as a paralyzing dread. Like, it can actually freeze us in our tracks, even when we do want to run. It's about feeling very vulnerable, being exposed. It's a sense that the audience, whether it's real or perceived, is negatively judging us, and there's a strong desire to run and hide. So I think that that's the physiological characteristics. I've thought about that quite a bit, and I think there's also there's beliefs underneath that are driving that. And the beliefs would be something like, there's something wrong with me. I am deeply flawed. I'm the worst person I know. I can remember, I still actually carry that one as, it's an interesting one. And there's actually value in that perspective, but it's not very fun to feel. And I don't deserve to be. It's actually, I believe, a major factor in suicide attempts and actual suicide is the belief that I do not deserve to be. So it's a very important subject, and it's difficult to face. I'm actually feeling some of it right now, just talking about it. It's one of these things where I've got a very good friend and mentor. He says, when you start talking about shame, you get some on you. And I don't know if you guys have noticed that maybe this subject is bringing on some of those feelings. So yeah, those are some of the things that I think about when I think about shame.
It's fascinating, because the physical and physiological response mirrors the emotional response and the emotional instinct to retreat. And the body kind of cues us in the same, it cues our body in the same way as it cues our mind, that the safety then is to isolate and retreat and remove yourself from the situation, you know?
Well, the problem with that, of course, is in a couple of instances that we mentioned, but also in addictions and addictive behavior, is it isolates us from help. And that's the real problem. And I think that's the main point that we're trying to discuss here today, is that you have to be aware of it, because it can be a real problem.
Yeah, I think about myself, and that my substance use was obviously private and secretive. But even when I would have days where I wasn't using any substance, my inclination was still to retreat and still to isolate myself, and that push people away. And so it had that effect on my relationships, but it also kind of created this loop where I would push people away and feel isolated and feel lonely and create a lot of bad feelings in myself and my negative self-talk. I would go and use a substance and then feel ashamed of that. And then, like, it was this feedback loop that would occur I think that made it really hard to get out of and hard to break on my own without support.
I would agree that feedback loop is not only circular, it's spiral, and it's spiraling down.
Yeah, exactly.
So
exactly.
To be able to recognize that in ourselves and others, and to intervene and change our response to it is really important. And I think it's a part of recovery that is maybe often overlooked. And I'm glad we're talking about it here today.
Yeah.
Yeah, it highlights the importance of awareness as a first step in many recovery processes, but this one especially, because I think it in that downward spiral, it's very easy to get lost. And once there's a certain point that's crossed, you kind of get into a danger zone, and that's what I recognized in myself. And it actually scared me enough I realized that I was spiraling in a direction that could actually be physically dangerous to my life. And I was fortunate enough to be able to stop that spiral by reaching out and making connections again. But it's easy to see how somebody could get to a certain point. You're down far enough on that spiral, and you lose the ability to kind of self-regulate, and even your awareness of where you're at, your lack of mental health, and just how dangerous the situation is. And yeah, I mean, this has got to be a contributing factor to a lot of suicides, or at least part of the process.
Yes, I would agree very much so that it is a factor in suicide, and people tend to suffer in quiet desperation. I can't remember who said that, but that's I think especially men we're subject to that, especially in the Western world where we're standing on your own 2 feet, and those kind of ideals really perpetuate that idea that there's something weak about reaching out for help. And when you're in shame, you really need help, and to be able to reach out for somebody else to recognize that and step in and lend a hand is really important. You could be throwing a lifeline to somebody. So if you recognize those behaviors in others, those isolating behaviors, it could be time to step in and be of some assistance there.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. Just as a side note, I've often wondered, and I've never seen any evidence or anybody do a study on this, but would you think that extroverts would have an advantage in this particular arena just because of their natural inclination to connect with people, as opposed to somebody who's already maybe used to being by themselves? Is there a difference between introverts and extroverts in this part of the recovery process?
I haven't really thought about that particularly. How about you, Corey? Have you thought about that point?
That's such an interesting question. I've noticed it.
Oh,
I think what I notice, and I don't know. I guess it's kind of a chicken or the egg question.
Right,
It makes me wonder if there are people who stay inward or are less vocal because of shame. And I can think of times when I've interacted with people and you can see them kind of come out of that shell and open up and get more comfortable with discussion. But I think it might be a slower process for the introvert. Although, you have to look no further than celebrities and the media to see a whole list of people that we would classify as extroverts who are very open and very vocal and outrageous or whatever, and who carry a lot of pain, have addictive behavior who I can think of, more cases than I could list right now of people who end up dying as a result of suicide or overdose. And you have to wonder, well, they put themselves out there to the world, and but obviously carried a whole lot of pain.
Mm-hmm.
Robin Williams comes to mind right away in that category, and you're right. It could be that extroverts are still susceptible to the suffering in silence. Maybe there isn't that much difference.
Well, I mean, it's. I wonder, is it just another way of masking that pain and that shame? And some of us mask by isolating and by wearing a mask that keeps us quiet and keeps us protected, and some of us wear a mask by that makes us a whole other person.
Right.
And I think about myself at work, and the mask that I had was that I was like this endless giver who would be constantly sort of patient and empathetic and bubbly might be the wrong word, but really, really friendly. And when I get honest about it, I didn't feel like that at the time, but that was this construct that I had that made me likable and I think I got a lot of acceptance from that. And that's how I got my sort of strokes. And but inside I didn't feel like that. Now I wasn't a Robin Williams or a Philip Seymour Hoffman or a Jim Morrison. But that was, as the nurse, that was who I was, and that was the identity that I took on. But that was in many ways sort of a masked behavior, or at least it was a persona that I took on.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know a single human being who doesn't employ that strategy at some point. It's part of our nature, and it's one of the ways that we signal to each other that we're on the same team. And I think that it actually kind of brings us to the next thing that we wanted to cover, which is, why do we experience shame? What advantage does it bring us individually? What advantages does it confer to our species? What is the point of this emotion? It must serve some purpose. What is that purpose?
Well, I ran across a quote from Freud. Not that I'm necessarily a Freudian. I think that he did some interesting work, but he said the first person to hurl an insult instead of a stone was the founder of civilization. And I thought that's pretty incredible. If as human beings we can sanction each other for behavior that's not acceptable within the group, but not kill each other over it, that's probably the first advantage right there. So that was interesting. And from my own studies, what I believe is the purpose of shame is to regulate the behavior of individuals in a group without the need of outright violence. So if we can, it's like an unspoken code of conduct, I guess. It actually helps to preserve the group. It exists to protect the group, not the individual, which is a really interesting thing. Our four basic emotions that we're kind of born with, anger, love, fear, and what's the other one? Anyways, the basic ones. And then there's, when we're working with these four kind of emotions in group work, what we often found was that shame would show up. It could show up at any time in any place. And where it was coming from was from the group. It doesn't originate necessarily with the individual. It's felt by the individual, but it's judgment from the group, and the group often has more power than the individual. So it's a very powerful tool to keep the individual in line when they're in a group. So the benefit for the individual as you may be at arm's length, that it may be. The benefit of shame in a group is that I have a group to belong to. And if I behave myself and, maintain the group norms, I can be a part of the group, and that affords me protection. So that's kind of the trade-off. Shame doesn't seem to be, we're not born with it, but we learn it between maybe 2-3 years old, when we start to really individuate and see ourselves as an individual. Then all of a sudden we feel the vulnerability that, I'm separate from the group and I have to behave myself in the group so that I'm accepted in the group. And it's actually quite dreadful, because it's a selection for survival for the group. I think biologically, it's not a selection for survival of the individual. The group will actually sacrifice the individual. They will banish them. They will exclude them so that at the expense of the individual, the group can survive. And that is the strength of our species, I think. So I think it's a very kind of ancient construct, and that's what it's for, is to maintain the integrity of a culture, a group, an idea, a family. You have to behave yourself if you want to belong. Otherwise, you're out.
Yeah.
And in ancient times, to be banished meant death. So it's not surprising that in the list of fears, public speaking, for instance, is rated higher consistently. It's number one in a list of fears, and death is somewhere down the line, 4, 5 down the line, facing death. So we fear shame. We fear the feeling of shame more than death itself. And I gave you some examples of somebody running off to a private bathroom to choke to death in a restaurant. That it's bizarre that it's that powerful.
Yeah, and it does make sense from a cultural standpoint and from a group dynamics standpoint. I wonder how that would play in. You've probably heard discussions about how when we were nomadic, the idea was that we roamed around in kind of smaller bands, and at some point, the number that I think here most commonly is 200. So once you're above 200 humans in a group or a tribe or a clan or whatever, there becomes a lot of conflict, and it becomes difficult to hold that group together without some kind of violence. So there's several kind of built-in. Some are built-in, like shame, I think is how you're describing, a built-in kind of regulator of the group. And then other things were brought in later to help bring the group together. Like religion would be an example of something that can hold bigger groups together without violence. So yeah, I didn't really consider. I mean, if you think of it from an individual's point of view, you're probably right. It probably doesn't serve the individual at all. No. And if you're looking at it evolutionarily, it makes sense.
It serves the group.
Yeah.
It serves the group, and it's why human beings, being as weak and fragile as we are, have been able to survive and thrive, is because it's part of the group dynamic that makes us very strong as a group. And so recognizing that, we don't want to banish ourselves. That's one of the things I learned about shame, is we don't need the group to banish us. We will banish ourselves. We will withdraw and isolate, right? And it can be deadly. It is actually a deadly behavior. So to challenge that and to step into a group, I really believe that if somebody walks into a self-help group, half of their recovery is already complete. It's half the job to get in the door. And I applaud anybody that, gets up from that place, feeling the shame and going and doing it anyway, stepping in that door and starting to ask for help. That is the beginning, and it's half the work. You're half done if you do that.
Agreed.
Yeah, I certainly agree too. Do you think it's like a preset or a pre-existing light switch that exists within us that gets turned on by something, by a social construct, or by family, or by the tribe, so to speak? Like, not all disapproval leads to shame. Not all conflict or molding or modeling leads to shame. But I was thinking that it's something that exists within us, but the social component has to turn it on, and then our own body and our own brain kind of does the rest, right? Like, in those sort of nomadic times that you were speaking of, or like at the dawn of human beings wearing clothing,
Right.
That was sort of the start of human modesty, and certainly shame had to be a part of that. And the last guy to come out of the cave not wearing the loincloth would have experienced shame very, very early on, and not known what to call it, but would have retreated and would have been, potentially sort of forced out or forced to conform. But if he was alone, that wouldn't have existed in the first place. He could have done whatever he pleased.
Right. But would the first guy say, the first guy who put on a pair of pants, you'd think the rest of the tribe would make fun of him? I
think that comes from the vulnerability that we realize when we're 2 or 3 years old and we start to individuate. What we realize is we can be separated from the protection of the group, of the family, and we feel alone, we feel vulnerable, which is a good response to have. And it protects kids from wandering off in the bush, basically. It keeps them close at hand. And I think the kind of mental, if you want to step it out, is that I am separate from the group, therefore I'm vulnerable. And I need the protection of the group, so I'm going to do whatever it takes to be accepted by the group. And that's kind of the beginning of the idea of if I don't toe the line, if I don't pull my weight, if I don't behave myself, I could be excluded, and I don't want that. So I start to mold my personality based on being separate. And it's interesting, if you look up shame in the dictionary, one of the ways it describes it is self-consciousness. And I really think that is self-awareness is what we are as an individual. And it's one of the traits of being a human being, or it takes a bit of a higher consciousness to realize that we're separate from the world, that we're separate from the group, that we do stand alone. And immediately we feel the vulnerability of that and the impetus to conform to the group. And I think that's how shame we start to internalize that. After a while, we don't need somebody to tell us the rules. We know when we step out of line. We can see it in the looks or the reactions of people, right? And
yeah,
like a psychological pheromone.
It is very interesting that we have that. And I think it is one of the strengths of group cohesion. And there is another one actually that I think is the positive feedback, which is praise. We can get both of those from the group. We can get shame when we're stepping out of line, and we can get praise and reward when we're doing good. And it can be a real motivator for mastery, for instance, to excel at a particular specialty. And that's another strength of human civilization, is we've developed specialties, so we don't all have to be good at everything. And I think that's where it starts, is that self-consciousness and having that feeling of shame and that reward mechanism of praise. I think those are kind of related.
So I'm just thinking about this from a evolution point of view here. And one would think that by now sociopathy would have basically been bred out of us. And yet it's a condition that remains, I think, fairly stable in populations, if I'm not mistaken. So I wonder if that's it. Maybe it's a gene that's linked to other useful attributes. That's probably what's going on there. But is that then the malfunction for people who, a true sociopath who has you basically have no shame, right? You don't feel bad. There's no negative emotional feedback. And it's interesting that continues to be a reality in our species, because you would think that those people would have been quickly ostracized and those genes would have perished.
I think that the values of individuality, especially in the Western world, kind of promote that behavior. The rugged individual is the typical the typical American or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. And that behavior is rewarded a lot in our culture. So there's also some mechanisms to have those outliers that are exceptional, and we reward them. Like, why do CEOs of companies end up getting billions and billions of dollars when they're not necessarily working for the benefit of everybody? They're very competitive, and they're building this empire for themselves. And I think it is actually one of the problems with the corporation itself starting to get human rights. It's immortal, and it has no conscience. It has no shame. So that is dangerous, I think. So that's another story, but there's a lot to this subject. It's very deep.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the other thing that I was thinking of is that there's that inherited piece where and I don't know about sociopathy, but with psychopathy, abuse, either physical abuse or sexual abuse, is part of that recipe. So they say, for, say, serial killers. And so if their grandparents, and particularly if you think about 200 years ago or 150 years ago, if their great grandparents didn't have the resources or the support or all of the factors that would lead one to change that behavior and to look inward, and then they handed that to their child, and then they handed that to their child, that there's the piece of it where it becomes, and Burton, you spoke at the beginning of breaking that cycle. I think that's part of the risk that if you look at the list of serial killers in North America, how many of those people experienced trauma or abuse or shame in their early upbringing, and then didn't, for whatever reason, weren't able to kind of break through that. But there's the inherited factor too. And I think if you asked them, would they even be willing to or able to see that as a factor and as the role that played? I don't know, but
they have done some experiments with kind of a scale of shame and what's the other one? Guilt, shame and guilt. And they did some fairly tough experiences for children, where they would basically accuse them of breaking something that belonged to an adult, and said, what happened here? Well, how come this is broken? Did you break this, kind of thing? And if there's a scale there, there's a range where children may tend to respond with more of a guilty kind of response, which is, I didn't realize, I didn't mean to break it. And they immediately try and put the thing back together. They start to try and fix it. They go into that mode of fixing it. Whereas some children react more with shame, which is a denial. I didn't do it, or get angry about it, or even, their eyes are averted and they turn inward and feel really bad about themselves for something they didn't even do, And so I think that's the first thing that we kind of have to sort out, is that how do we personally respond to a mistake, an error, or whatever? Do we respond with shame where we feel bad about ourselves? Or do we respond with that more of a guilty thing where I'm going to take responsibility for it and I'm going to try and fix it? I don't know how much that relates to, these disorders of being a psychopath or whatever, but it seems to me that that's a deficiency where they can't feel shame, and that can lead to some real problems behaviorally.
Yeah. What you're talking about there is it's kind of the basis of what I believe to be one of the factors in people who successfully recover from addiction is whether they internalize whatever brought them to, whether it was a trauma or a series of mistakes or poor decisions, whatever brought them to the point where they found themselves physically dependent, psychologically dependent upon a substance, and now they wanted, they're kind of at that crossroads. If the person in question is able to view it as a mistake and something that is fixable, as opposed to a character defect, then you would imagine they would have an easier road back, or at least they would be motivated to attempt to make it back. Whereas, despondence might be the outcome for the other person.
Or withdrawal, or continuing with the numbing of some substance use, right? Because that's one of the things that substance use does for us, is it down regulates our emotions, including shame, right? So we don't feel it. But of course, it doesn't fix the problem. We need to, look at, like you said, look at what it is that we can fix and externally start to work on it. And I think that's why it's important that you're talking about it in Recovery Machine, because some people I don't think even recognize what they're really up against. It's not their drug of choice they're up against. It's the shame that's driving it. And I really do think it's a driver in addiction and continued use.
Yeah. So and that's what our next question to you was, Burton, was the role that shame plays in the addictive process. And then we want to talk a little bit about the role that shame plays in the recovery process and the effect it can have. But we talked about that feedback loop where the shame exists before addiction in many cases, and then there's the shame as it relates specifically to addiction. But so I guess my question is, what do you I don't know, what do you think? What do you see in people or in yourself where is the role of it? How does that link form? How does it take you to that place?
I've actually come to the point where I believe that the addictive behavior and the cycle around it is not the problem itself. It is actually a symptom of internalized shame. If I don't know, that might be a bit of a radical statement, but I really do think that that's what we're trying to do with the addictive process, is downregulate shame, which is extremely painful. I call it it's the social pain. We have emotional pain, we have physical pain, and some may even say we have spiritual pain, where we feel disconnected from the source of life and those kind of things. But I believe that shame is manifest in social pain, and drug use or alcohol use that downregulates pain can be very seductive. It works. We find, even in the pain, the kind of social pain that we experience in teenage years, where we're socially awkward and trying to find our way, and somebody brings some booze to a party, man, all sorts of things can happen. And I feel great. I feel, I'm free from that pain that I feel almost every day at school or whatever. Right. and it can be very seductive. So I think that it's an integral part of what the addictive process is, and we need to recognize that and deal with it to have an effective and long-term recovery. We need to pay attention to shame and recognize that it is a motivator and actually the fuel for relapse as well. You know, if we get into a position where we're feeling shame again, even though we've been doing well, we have some sort of slip, it can really fuel us back into a serious relapse.
Do you think there's a sliding scale, so to speak, as far as how likely somebody is to turn to shame or internalize an event as shame? There's a fairly for example, Dr. Gabor Mate is a proponent of the belief that all addiction is trauma based.
Mm-hmm.
I don't buy into that totally. I think that there are cases where people just simply lose control of a recreational kind of crutch that's, and it becomes an addiction that's not based on them trying to cover up some sort of pain from trauma. But I also see that in many, many, many cases, trauma is part of that event. So do you think that some people are just naturally inclined to kind of respond to maybe what would be considered a mild traumatic event to one person turns into a major issue for somebody else that they just internalize as shame, and then that goes on to fuel a substance abuse problem?
Well, we talked a little bit about the difference between feeling guilty and feeling shame, and I think that that's probably the kind of the first step. If people have the similar experience and they are farther up on the scale where they would feel that as guilt, then they may be empowered to make restitution and change their behavior, and use it as a learning experience and go on and grow from that. If somebody has that same experience and they experience it as more a shame, where I'm a bad person, there's something wrong with me, that can be much more difficult to deal with. And if they find something that masks that pain, because shame is very painful, if they can find something to mask that pain, it's very seductive. So does that answer your question? Is that what you're meaning?
Yeah, it does. So go ahead,
sorry,
Corey.
no, please, you go ahead, Nathan.
So what I'm understanding from you, Dad, is that the statement you made earlier that all you believe addiction is largely fueled from shame, and what I'm curious about is, would that shame then always be linked to some kind of substantial trauma? Or I guess, like we were just discussing there, I mean, the whole aspect of trauma is completely subjective. So it totally would depend upon the sensitivity of the individual to perceive an event as traumatic. And then it would depend on their tendency to internalize that event as something that is wrong with them, as opposed to something that happened to them that is maybe they were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but not your existence is wrong.
Well, I think one of the ways that we tend to make that decision to say there's something wrong with me, especially if we're traumatized within a family unit or by our caregivers, our loved ones that are supposed to be taking care of us. There's an event that happens in the home. Dad comes home drunk and is fighting with mom. I can't, as a child, even consider the possibility that there's something wrong with my caregivers that I rely on for my very life. I can't even face that. So how do I experience that? I experience that violent interaction between my parents as there's something wrong with me. That's how it starts. I really do think that if it's at that point where I cannot face the possibility that my caregivers that I rely on for my very life are unreliable and maybe even dangerous, I have to put it on me. And that's how I think shame starts right there. And that might not be the only way, but that would be an example of how it could start.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
I totally agree with you, Burton. I mentioned this in the meeting that we all attended on Thursday, the Dr. Mattei quote, where he says trauma is not the event that happens to you, whatever that may be. Trauma is the internal event that happens in response to the external. I'm highly paraphrasing there, but I think of this, that like here's an example from my life. I had lots of dental issues as a kid, and I didn't have any sort of front teeth until I was 13 years old. And when I was maybe 11 or 12, a teacher made fun of me in front of the entire class for not having any front teeth. And now, as an adult, and I've worked through that memory, and I remember throughout my whole life thinking, well, that wasn't that traumatic. That wasn't that big of a deal. But it always stuck with me. And it made, I was self-conscious as it was of that. And it made me more self-conscious because it drew attention to it, and he got a big laugh from the class and stuff. But I was able to rationalize it by saying, oh no, that wasn't a trauma. But what happened to me inside as a 11 or 12-year-old was shame. And it directly made that connection between shame and the social aspect of it, and then kind of feeling like I needed to retreat. And again, so the trauma to an adult, if that happened to me now, wouldn't be the same, but through the lens of an 11 or 12-year-old sort of prepubescent or preteen going through that's devastating. And now I can look at it and say, what an asshole teacher. But then it was like, no, what an asshole I am.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a couple of points there. Corey, thanks for sharing that, because that is, to me, that's one of the shame breakers, is to share it within a group that understands and supports and recognize that, so we can support you in that. A couple of points there. One is it happened to your face. He was specifically talking about your teeth, and that's very vulnerable. Our face is very vulnerable to shame, and we experience shame in our face. We get the blush response. We want to cover our eyes. We want to protect ourselves. So when you're insulting someone's looks, their face, that is a shaming event. And the other point that I wanted to make there, he didn't do that in private with you. He didn't do it with you in front of your loved ones and your parents that could protect you. He singled you out, and he said it within the group and elicited a group response. And that is the real power of shame, is that it carries the weight of the group, and it's devastating to the individual. You have almost no defense against that. You're vulnerable. Yeah. And it's often done that way. People, they don't come and confront you about something they're pissed off about in private. They wait until you're in their group, and then they elicit the support of the group to shame you. So there's two main points there. One, that it happens to your face, and we're very vulnerable in our face to shame. And number two, that somebody used the group against you. And that's why it's so powerful and painful and traumatic.
Absolutely. And anything that occurs through the lens of a child is interpreted very differently than it would, at least for me, as an adult. So being compassionate about that, or being understanding of that the person who internalized that was just a kid, has also been helpful. And I don't want to jump too far ahead here, but yeah, I think that breaking that down, and that's just one kind of, but it's kind of a good example, because it shows all of the factors that are at play there. But of course, to be compassionate to to ourselves takes growth and takes insight and work. And again, for an 11-year-old, I'm not sure that I would have to have been a pretty enlightened 11-year-old, I think, to figure that one out. But yeah.
I think that's why we need help with shame. The group is the source, can be the source of shame. But if we can actually find a supportive and understanding group, it can be the opposite. It can be the cure. That's why group work throughout my whole life has been so important. One-on-one stuff is great, but often the counselor is somewhat elevated in status. So you have this more of a parent-child kind of relationship with a counselor, where I think that's the real beauty and magic of peer support, is we get together in a group that we feel that we relate to and that we connect with, and we support each other. And it's easier to accept in a group it's safer because we're peers, right? We're at the same level. And I had one experience when I was fairly early on in my recovery. I had some of my other sisters show up at a meeting, and they were talking about their experience, and it was particular to them. It was unique to them, but it was also a shared experience. And that was a huge support for me in my early recovery, for, some of my other sisters to show up, tell their story, from their perspective. It was a little different, but we were there together supporting each other. And that equal playing field of that kind of peer support group, I think it's underutilized myself. I think we rely too much on the counselor and client kind of thing. There's value there. But when we're dealing with shame, we need to feel like we're on an even playing field, and those peer support type things like Obsidian, like we're working on here. That's why we do it, is because there's real value in being able to hear other people's story that we can identify with and feel empathy with and show support to. So we're kind of taking shame and putting it on its head. Shame uses the group against us, and peer support actually takes the support of the group to help heal and protect the individual.
I wanted to ask about in recovery, or in recovery groups. And I don't want to sound like I'm bashing the 12-step model, but I wondered, you mentioned about a slip or a minor relapse. In the model of taking all of someone's days of recovery away and bringing you back to day 0,
mm-hmm.
versus just saying, this was a slip, here's what you learned from it, keep going. You're
Right.
still, is that to the detriment of the person who's experienced that slip or that struggle? And is there any evidence about that?
Well, from my experience, like my early experience in late 80s, early 90s was a lot of 12-step stuff, and there's real value there for sure. But you have to remember, the 12 steps came from 2 struggling alcoholics, right? And at that time, the clergy had failed, the government had failed, the medical profession had failed, psychiatric world had failed. And what you had is you had 2 people of equal status. They were both alcoholics, that they could trust each other as equals, that came together and started to help each other. They basically said, I can't help myself, I'm going to help you. And the other person said the same thing. And that was the beginning of the 12 steps. And that was revolutionary at the time. Alcoholics were considered, I can't remember the word they used, but basically they were a lost cause, that nobody could help them. We've tried all these things, you can't help them. And 2 guys got together and helped each other. So that equal footing, where I don't have to feel shame when I look you in the eye and you don't have to feel shame. We understand each other. That's the beginning of coming back. So there's lots of value in the 12 steps. And I have got a lot of good use out of it, but it's not the it's not perfect. And that might be one that I would agree with, that by taking away all a person's clean time with one slip rather than seeing it for what it is, there's a huge debate around that, and there's different models. What I would suggest as if somebody's looking for help is to find a counselor that works for you, shop around, find one that actually you can resonate with. And the same thing with groups. Find the group that actually works for you, that makes sense to you, whether it's a 12-step model or a smart recovery or, other models that are out there. You don't have to, it's not just the 12 steps anymore. There's lots of different models. Find one that fits for you, that resonates with you, that you can agree with, and leave it at that. I think there's lots of value in the 12 steps. That might not be one of them. I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that definitely makes sense.
Yeah.
I've been considering, for me, vulnerability is an important kind of metric for many different, personal growth, mental health, all sorts of different ways that it kind of plays into how I kind of struggled and recovered and understood myself through, putting myself in positions that were uncomfortable and kind of forcing myself back into social situations and stuff like that. But I wonder if maybe the reason that peer support groups and that equal footing, like you talk about there, is one of the reasons it's so successful, is because it might be easier to be vulnerable, open, and honest with somebody who is on equal footing, as opposed to, when you're in a patriarchal or a top-down kind of relationship, where you might not know where that information is going. Or, personally, I tend to feel like I've been to therapy, and I've had, not much success with it, but a lot of it was, I think, the quality of the connection and my ability to kind of open up and be vulnerable, where I found it harder to trust somebody who was in that position where I at least perceived they might be judging me, versus, somebody in a group may be judging me, but it's not a quote unquote professional judgment, if that makes sense.
Yes. And I think that the paradox there is the trust risk paradox. To be able to take some risk and step in the door, I need to trust a little bit. But to trust a little bit, I need to take a risk. And you got to start somewhere. And it's really hard to start from zero. So I think that's one of the benefits of having a group that is like-minded and, experiencing the same problem. At least when you step in the door, you're on the same footing. So when you start hear other people trusting enough to share their story, you think, okay, I can see they took a risk there. They didn't get shamed in front of the group. Maybe this is a safe place, and I can open up a little bit, and I can trust a little bit. So I can take a little, and risk trust starts to build. And I think that's, you really kind of need a neutral environment or somewhere to start that's pretty neutral. A lot of people that start with self-help groups end up going to therapy and talking to an authority figure in that subject later on, and that's part of their recovery and part of their, improved mental health. But I really think that this component of the peer support type group is vital in getting that footing to get started, and it can't be underestimated. I think it's been a powerful influence in my life for sure.
Yeah, mine as well. So I guess what people are probably wondering is, we've been talking about shame, how to detect it, understand it, define it, be aware of it. But what do you do with it? What do you do with this emotion? How do you process it? Are there tools that we can use to defend against it or work through it? What have you had success with there in the past, Dad?
Well, I've done a lot of group work. Like I said, it was part of my own recovery was to start groups and facilitate groups. And one of the things we started to realize early on is that shame is something that can show up in a group. And then we started to understand that it is the group itself that has the power. So either the facilitator wielding the power of the group, as in your case, Corey, where the teacher who is kind of wielding the power of the group focused that shame on you. That's a risk. It can happen in groups. It happens all the time. So to manage that, we started to develop first an awareness that was going on, and then a response to it. And some of the responses there's a list of them, and I've got them, I got them right on my whiteboard here still. It's acceptance, attention, acknowledgement, affirmation, and affection. And some of the honorable mentions that I've worked on more recently is appreciation and the development of mastery. I'm not too sure about that one, but I do think that, anyways, there's all of those. And for instance,
can you repeat those slower for everybody?
Okay, so acceptance, attention, acknowledgement, affirmation, affection, and appreciation is one, and then the development of mastery. So so those are different things that we've worked on over the years, and by focusing on noticing when shame shows up in a group is one of the things you need to do, and kind of ask people to speak with I statements, for instance, instead of saying, you, which is that finger pointing, that accusation kind of thing. If I can acknowledge that what I'm saying within a group is my opinion and not necessarily correct, it's just my opinion. It's less likely that it's going to land on you in a shameful way, that I'm judging you. So those kind of techniques within groups to prevent and minimize shame within the group is really important. And I did make some notes about those things. It's, if you're interested in specifics, or we could talk about one of them maybe.
Yeah, there's a couple that I have questions about. For what do you mean when you say acceptance? Like accepting that shame is just a ubiquitous nature of being human, or what do you?
I think it's more to do with shifting shame more towards guilt. So if somebody said, I did such and such, and you say, okay, I see that you did such and such, what did you do with that? How did that go for you? What was that experience? Rather than saying, oh my God, that's terrible, just being accepting of what is, rather than laying a judgment on someone, and just using that in my language, in the group dynamics. If I'm the facilitator, if somebody's using language that's not accepting of what is in the group and what's going on, I might correct them as far as, or ask them to, could you say that in a way that's, less, I don't know.
Shameful?
Well, even saying that can be a judgment. It's very delicate within the group, right? So the facilitator has to be aware of this going on and really lead by example, I guess, is what you do as facilitating. You have to lead by example, to use non-shaming behavior. And people feel enough shame. You don't have to rub it in. You don't have to add to it. So, that's already there. You just don't want to amplify it within the group, which is very easy to do.
Okay, that makes sense. Could you tell us what you've got awareness and you've got attention there? So I think awareness is pretty. We've discussed that and the importance of it, and then how does that relate to attention in your definitions there?
So it's attention, I would say. Yeah, attention. Yeah, all these A words. So attention is to be able to see it without judgment. So when I'm somebody's telling their story, I'm looking at them. I'm paying attention to it, and it's bringing it into the light. And that's often the risk about, it's the exact thing that somebody that's feeling shame does not want. It does not want it in the light, right? So by giving attention to it in a non-judgmental way, we can model that I see you. And you may have noticed that I use those phrases sometimes when we're doing our Obsidian meetings. I see you and I hear what you're saying. People that are in shame really need to be heard. They're isolated, they're alone, they're afraid, they don't know how to deal with it. They're in this loop of shame that's beating on them internally. What they need is to be seen without judgment. I see you, I hear you, I'm here with you, those kind of messages, right? And it can draw people into a place that's safe where they can start to process this stuff. So that would be an example. These were developed with a very good mentor of mine named Marv Schmunk, who is an amazing guy in group dynamics. He's just an absolute master at it. And he was the one that started really developing these tools of handling and dealing with shame in the process, in the group work, because it is a danger. It's really easy to use the power of the group against an individual. We have to be aware of it, and we have to be able to intervene and support people so that they're not shamed out of the group. That's happened to them in their whole lives, right? That's why they're alone. That's why they're in addiction in the first place, is because they're carrying a lot of shame about their behavior or the judgments that people had about them. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's really good stuff. And you call all these A words you and Marv have grouped together. You call them shame breakers, right?
Right. In group dynamics, we were dealing a lot with at least 1/4 of what we were doing in group work was to do with addictions. And so the main emotional energies we're working with is anger, fear, love, and here I am blanking out again. Anyways,
is it joy that is
yes,
that the other?
Yeah, joy is one of them for sure. So those 4, but shame would show up. We're working with these energies, and something in the dynamic where shame would show up, and we kept wondering, what is this? Where is this? How does shame fit into this model? And what we found was that joy and shame are actually connected on a continuum. And if we are dampening down other emotions to be able to dampen down and suppress shame, especially with an addictive behavior like taking a substance that dampens down our emotions, we really lose access to joy in our life. And that is it just becomes a darker world. Yes, I've dampened down my shame by, obliterating myself with my drug of choice, but I'm not getting access to much joy in my life either. So,
yeah, that's right. That's an excellent perspective, and that definitely checks out with me. Would you agree with that, Corey?
Yeah, that is fascinating to make that connection between shame and joy. I was just thinking about shame as one of you guys mentioned it as self-consciousness or self-awareness. And, I used an analogy. Nathan and I were talking a few episodes back that joy as a spiritual experience. And, I think about being a kid and going to hockey games and being so engrossed in it and so just enthralled. And when the team would score or when the team would win, and having like that explosion of emotion and feeling joy in that, whatever, 30 seconds or minute of celebration and of joy, there was no self-consciousness there.
Yeah.
I wasn't thinking about myself at all. I wasn't thinking about how I was reacting. Wasn't thinking about how I looked, about anything. It was just that moment of expression of that feeling in my body.
Yeah. Exactly. That's
great. And there's a spiritual side to that too, right? And it is a side that as shame goes up, that the ability, shame goes up, or addiction, that ability to experience that level of joy without self-consciousness drops big time.
Yeah. Absolutely. And that's when I ran into a point where I realized that I felt okay for about half an hour every day. The rest of the time I was struggling with some kind of, side effect from substance abuse, whether it was drowsiness or constipation or, whatever the problem was, apathy or lack of energy. That's kind of how you basically become flatlined in that respect. You feel absolutely nothing. And I can remember just kind of having a conversation with myself and asking, what are you doing with your time? What is the point of this? I mean, this can't be why I'm here. If there is a why, it's not to live like this.
Mm-hmm. That is the amazing road to recovery that I can attest to, is that I came from a place in a childhood and a young life of shame to a place of joy. That is the reward for the hard work of recovery, and I recommend it to everybody. The path out of shame is towards joy, and I wish it for everybody. And it's part of the reason why I still continue to do this work, because what better way to live our life than to have access to joy? It's awesome.
Yeah, well said.
Very well said. I wondered about asking you guys about this. That I observe such an inclination for folks in the groups that I attend to. You often hear folks say, "I was having a really bad day. I'm feeling really crappy today, and I almost didn't come to the meeting." And there seems to be, and I've experienced this too, where on a bad day or on a dark day, I don't feel like going there and sharing and being open and being vulnerable. And invariably, when I do go and I do express myself and I do try that vulnerability on, I do feel better. But it's actually, I think for myself, it's that same voice of shame, which is so linked to that addict voice, so to speak, that tells us, don't go and share with Nathan and Burton. Be by yourself, stay inward, ruminate in those thoughts. Mm-hmm. and pushing back against that and saying, no, I'm going to go to the group and I share and I feel better. And then of course, for myself or for anyone else who comes to the group and shares and shows that vulnerability, everyone benefits from that. And there's always, that's where the lessons are. That's where the dialogue, the really good dialogue comes from. But that inclination to not share or not participate when we're having a bad day, I think that for some people, it seems like and it's a very internal one, but an expectation that, oh no, you only participate if you're feeling strong and feeling good. But I really don't think that's the case at all,
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. If that was the case, then, well, my Obsidian groups would be basically useless, because it's not the people who are having a good day that bring the firepower.
No.
It's the people who are having a rough time, and it's them putting themselves in a vulnerable position, expressing their pain or their struggle, and other people seeing that, being reminded and learning. That's the whole part. So yeah, if everybody just went when they're, well, I think they would shut the place down, because obviously nobody's got a problem.
I would agree that that's that I call that my addictive voice, or my addicted voice wants me to be alone, wants me to be separate, and because I'm more vulnerable to triggers for any kind of addictive behavior that I might have, whether that's whatever they are. There's lots of them, and people know what their own triggers are, but it is fueled by isolation. And that addictive, that I call it my addict mind, will give me those messages. Don't go online today don't go on the meeting today. Don't pick up that phone and talk to your sponsor or your friend. Don't do that. Just stay here and be miserable. That's kind of the message, right?
Yeah, totally.
And when we challenge that and we feel better at the end of the meeting, we're building new neural pathways that remind us that there is a better way. We can get out of this. There is a pathway out of addiction and out of isolation, out of that misery of being alone. And just because shame is trying to chase us out the door, saying, you don't belong here, you better run and hide and cover your face. When we challenge that and find that there is places of support and love and connection and joy, that the addictive personality or the addictive mind gets quieter and quieter, and has less power over our life. And I really believe in that. I'm a much more joy-filled person today than I was when I was a child that couldn't even look somebody in the eye because I was carrying so much shame. I highly recommend it. When you don't feel like going to a meeting, that's exactly the time to go to a meeting.
Yeah, that's fantastic stuff. You have brought the goods. There's lots of interesting material there for people to think about, and some stuff that I'd never heard before, and always a good perspective, Dad. Really appreciate you taking the time to do this. I know, we've been having some difficulties personally in our family with health issues and stuff like that, but we're doing okay. And I appreciate you taking the time to come on here and share your thoughts. I think they're important for people to hear.
Thanks, Nathan. And I do agree that, we've been through a bit of a tough patch lately with health issues in the family, but it's interesting to see how the work we've done in recovery, in building relationships, restoring relationships, having honest and loving contact within the family because people are doing their individual work, is such a benefit at a time of crisis, that we've rallied together and we're helping each other. Sometimes when a big health issue comes into, or, a big problem comes into a family, it just makes things worse and things shatter and fall apart, and people are even more alone. And it's one of the reasons why I spent so much time in my young life that actually cost you time with your dad. And I am fully aware of that.
Mm-hmm.
But here we are doing something together as adults that I don't think would have been possible if I hadn't, done the work that got me here. And, I'm very proud of what you're doing with Recovery Machine and Obsidian. And it's because it's all those little steps along the way that we've taken as a family. We're much better off than we were. And we're certainly much better off than the predecessors that I talked about earlier when I did the family tree, and I could see the mess that this whole family had been in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're doing better.
Yeah.
It's not perfect yet, but we're on the right path and we're going the right direction. So
Yeah.
really proud of what you're doing here with Recovery Machine and with Obsidian.
Thanks. Appreciate that. What do you think, Corey?
Thank you, Burton. Thanks for being here with us. I just wanted to add, I think that for both of you guys, the unique thing that you guys bring as a father-son duo in the Obsidian meetings is you model the openness and that the conversation can include family, and to break that barrier and break that wall, which brings us back to shame. That inclination that you don't have that difficult conversation with your family and don't include the circle, because it does take there's a team approach there, and there's a huge benefit to that team approach. And you guys certainly model that for all of the people who come to your meetings, and certainly for myself as well. And to see that it works is, it's been very, very helpful for me.
Oh, that's good to hear, Corey. Thanks.
Thanks, Corey. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I hope it's helpful to others as well.
All right. I think we'll call it a wrap, guys. That was an excellent discussion, and we will see everybody next time. Check us out on YouTube and Spotify, and feel free to leave comments on YouTube. We appreciate that. Let us know how we're doing, and subscribe to our channel as well. That helps with the algorithm. And to get a hold of us via email if you wish, it's us@recoverymachine.org. That's us@recoverymachine.org. All right, everybody. We will see you next time.
Thanks, everybody. See you soon.
Thanks for having me.